During these lockdown times, there's been a bit of a resurgence in certain hobbies. One hobby in particular that I know a lot about is sourdough baking. Now, I don't just know about it because it's a hobby. I actually briefly worked as a sourdough baker. I had a great time doing it. Unfortunately, getting up at 4 in the morning every single morning in the middle of winter just took its toll on me emotionally, and I had to quit. I still love sourdough baking though, and I thought that maybe this week I would give you a bit of an intro as to what sourdough baking is, and if you haven't already gotten into it, maybe give you the skills to make a starter and then join me in a few weeks' time baking a loaf of bread together. Sourdough baking is the way that we used to make bread before we discovered what yeast was 160 years ago. Louis Pasteur, famous for pasteurization, discovered yeast in 1859, and it changed the way that we think about baking and brewing and a whole load of other things. We now have powdered yeast, dried yeast in packets that you can buy at the supermarket, you sprinkle into your mix, and you can make bread like that, so quickly. That yeast that you've got in there is Saccharomyces. Saccharomyces is a sugar eater. So saccharin, sugar, Saccharomyces eat sugar. The Saccharomyces, as eating this sugar, is pooping out CO2 and a little bit of alcohol, but not enough to really write home about. That CO2 is what inflates your bread. It's the air bubbles, it's the holes. There's two parts to what makes the bread. There's the CO2 that's inflating it, and then there's the gluten that's holding that CO2 in, like a balloon. In order to make gluten happen quicker, we decided to knead dough. So by putting the glutens under stress, you make it stretchier. Kneading the dough is the way that we do that. So if you've ever made a loaf of bread and you've just sprinkled in yeast and you've kneaded it, the reason you're doing it is because of that. It's so that you can get a quick loaf of bread. Sourdough baking is a little bit slower than that. To make a starter from scratch will take you at least 2 weeks, and that is your yeast alternative. The starter has a whole lot going on in there, a whole lot more than just in this little packet. There's Saccharomyces for sure, but there's a whole load of other cultures in there as well. That starter is a living machine. It is a small amount of dough. I've got some here. It is a small amount of dough that already has the yeast and bacteria in that you want it to have. So this has got Saccharomyces and a few other guys. And actually, I might go over the few other guys. There are at least 5 guys that I'm worried about. Saccharomyces. We've already met Saccharomyces. Saccharomyces is the workhorse of making bread. It makes CO2 and it makes it well. Then there's Brettanomyces. Now, Brett, or Brettanomyces, is actually in the family of Saccharomyces, but this gives a lot of flavor. It will give you sort of a fruitiness, kind of a ripe banana-iness, a tartness. It's funky. It's described as funky. It will give you a whole load of flavor, and it's actually a flavor that I really like to have in my bread. Sourdough actually doesn't have to be sour. It just depends how these 5 guys are working. So we've got our CO2 in our Saccharomyces. We've got our Brettanomyces for some fruity flavors. We've got Pediococcus. Now Pediococcus, we don't really want a whole load of this guy, but you should at least be aware that he exists. So Pediococcus, he works in tandem with Brettanomyces. They can create a ropiness to your dough. There will be a stringiness, and it'll hold together in a very different way. Beer can be infected with Pediococcus, and when it does, it ends up with a platelet on the top. You end up with like a film. If you've seen my kombucha video, that film is probably Pediococcus that's holding everything together. You don't really want that on a beer, especially in thin layers, and you don't want it in your bread. You don't want to have sort of a bit dangling out. Whilst he's not a baddie, you should just be aware that he's there. Then we've got Lactobacillus. Now Lactobacillus is a great guy. You know him from sauerkraut and kimchi and yogurts and all kinds of things. In the same way that Saccharomyces eats sugar, Lactobacillus eats lactose. Anything that ends in an ose is probably a sugar. Maltose, dextrose, glucose, sucrose, fructose, lactose. So they're all sugars. And Lactobacillus will eat the lactose and will actually put out quite a bit of acidity. It'll lower the pH of your starter, which isn't a bad thing. We need a bit of acidity to keep everything going on. But that will add some of the tartness that you might be desiring in your sourdough. If you like your sourdoughs to be sour, then this is the guy that you're going to be looking out for. And then you've got acetobacter. Now, acetobacter is vinegar. He tends to come along when all of these other guys have died out. If you've got acetobacter going on in your starter, then you've left it too long. It's nothing to panic about, it's just something to be aware of. And like I say, these 5 guys that are playing out inside of your starter, they might be different levels. You might want a lot of this guy and not a lot of these guys, or you might want a lot of this guy and not much of the others. But there's an interplay. Because they all exist in the same house, they all are fighting for room. You get to maintain the peace by deciding when to feed your starter. If you really like the Brett funky, fruity flavour, when you get that fruity smell in your starter, that's probably the time to feed your starter again. You want to encourage it when it's doing something that you like. The name starter suggests what it does. It starts off the process of making the bread. So with this jar here, I can make enough for maybe a half a loaf of bread and still have enough left over to then refill the jar and start again. That's very important. You do need to keep the starter going. You can't use it all in one loaf. You've got to keep a little bit left over. Now, if I want to make more than a half a loaf of bread, then I need to have an intermediary. That intermediary is called a leaven. Basically, a leaven is just a large version of the starter. So I'll take a little bit of this and I will mix it up to make a larger version, and I'll use that larger version to make 2, 3, 4, 7 loaves of bread, whatever it needs. To make that, you need flour and water. My mix that I use is 50% wholemeal, 50% plain flour. I actually have a batch of that pre-mixed already in a tub, always mixed so that I'm ready to feed the starter, because I feed it every single morning, and that's important. You feed it the same time every single day. So take 50 grams of body temperature water and 50 grams of your flour mix and fully incorporate them, get them all pasted together to make a dough. Then cover the jar, put it in a jar if you haven't already mixed it in a jar. Cover it up with some tissue paper, kitchen towel, handkerchief, just something that will let the air move in and out freely, but not let the bugs move in and out freely. Leave that, set that aside, and then do the same thing again tomorrow, the same time again, every single day, except there's one small change. So you don't just throw away the whole thing and start off one. Take a teaspoon of the starter that you made yesterday, put it in the water for today, mix it well until you've got nice cloudy water, and then add your 50 grams of flour, mix it up, set it aside, cover it up. The starter that you made the day before, you can throw that away. Doesn't really matter. Dilute it and throw it down the sink, put it in the toilet, throw it at your cat, I don't really mind. That's also one of the reasons why we have a small amount, not a large amount, because you don't want to be throwing away a huge amount every day. This one will fill the jar. So you'll notice this. If you feed this every single day for 2 weeks, you will start to notice bubbles forming and you will notice it rise and fall. Now this will probably fall to maybe there. It was all the way at the top of there at its peak. Once you've noticed a rise and a fall, then you've got yourself a yeast that's ready to go, and you can probably join me with baking the loaf of bread. So I'll go into a bit more detail of that technique there. See you there.